Now let's have the second presenter. We are pleased to welcome Professor Randy LaPolla. Randy LaPolla is a professor in Nanyang Technological University. Professor LaPolla.
Wait, Tanisha, Danqing, you have to unshare. You have to turn off your sharing.
Okay.
Thanks. Okay, thanks. Sorry.
Let me introduce Randy LaPolla, Professor LaPolla. Professor LaPolla received his PhD in linguistics from UC Berkeley. Before joining Nanyang Technological University, he was chair of linguistics at La Trobe University, Melbourne, Australia. He was elected fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities and president of the Australian Linguistic Society. He was also head of the linguistics program during most of his tenure at La Trobe. Professor LaPolla has done research in various areas of linguistic typology, especially in East Asian language. He has worked on the typology and morphosyntactic patterns of Sino-Tibetan languages, examined methodology for carrying out linguistic work in these languages, and also done language documentation in Chang Language and Dulong Rawang. And today he will be sharing with us his opinion on the Asian languages. The title is Contributions of Some Asian Languages to Typology. Please give him a very good welcome.
Thank you very much. And I thank you to I'd like to say my thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I'm very happy to be able to talk with everybody. This is not a group I ordinarily get to meet with very often, so I'm very happy to make some new friends here. In this presentation, I'd like to address the theme of the conference, which is how can Asian languages contribute to linguistic typology, to make the point that Asian languages have actually been very important in the development of linguistic typology over the last 40 years. There's much more that can be done, of course, if we continue to do the careful empirical work on natural language data. Wait. Okay, it's not going forward. Somehow my slides are not working properly. Hold on a second. I have to undo that. Somehow my screen is, hold on, sorry. Somehow my screen is, oh, there we go. Okay. Much of what I will be citing will be my own work, as it is what I know best. And because most of my career, I've been trying to get typologists to pay more attention to Asian languages and how they differ from languages that the typologists are more used to, and to see how they force us to expand the traditional typologies and even make us rethink our assumptions about how language works. All along, I focused on understanding the languages based on analysis of natural language use. So my goal as a linguist is to understand languages, not to create theories or anything. So I'm not one of these people who's into theory building. But when we respect the languages and their speakers and let them teach us, we can actually learn much about not only the language, but about communication and the cognition and behavioral principles involved in human interaction. So the things I'd like to talk about today are principles of closed structure, information structure, non-systemic morphology, word order typology, hierarchical person marking, clausal noun modifying constructions, transitivity and transitivity harmony, middle voice marking, and evidentials. And these are all areas where Asian languages have made a contribution to a typology. So in terms of the principles of closed structure, traditional grammar, including Chomskyan grammar, was based on Indo-European languages and assumed all languages have subject and object, case systems, clear form class distinctions, and other features of Indo-European languages. That is, they assumed that in all languages, the principles of clause structure were the same. And so they simply just applied those same categories and whatnot in the same way of language kind of structure to all these languages. As Dreyer argues, these concepts were not crucial for the early 20th century structuralists, but like Bloomfield and them, but were brought back into typology and then language description because of Greenberg's reliance on them in his typologies and because of the grammatical theory called relational grammar, which saw them as primitives. Only in the 1980s did work on the non-Indo-European languages, including many Asian languages, begin to lead to a slow awakening to the diversity of possible linguistic structures. And I say slow awakening because if you read material from the 70s and 80s and even 1990s, they're still very much influenced by this Indo-European bias and trying to force Asian languages into this Indo-European structures. The early typologists also held on to the structuralist assumption that a language is one system where all things held together, and talked about whole languages as being of one type or another in regard to some phenomenon, such as grammatical alignment or being an agglutinative language or an active language. But as Bickel argues in a special volume of Linguistic Typology on what is typology, he argues that modern typology has moved away from typologizing entire languages and instead takes individual structural patterns, constructions, rules, constraints, etc., as comparanda, in other words, the things we compare. Linguistic diversity is captured by large sets of fine-grained variables, not by grand type notions. So this is a very different way of doing typology, but this is the way we do it now in the 21st century. In the 1980s,
excuse me, Professor LaPolla, your PowerPoint doesn't work right now. We couldn't follow your PowerPoint.
Okay. Why? See, this is what I was afraid of. Can you make me host so that I can actually post this?
Yeah, now you're co-host, I'm sure.
Yeah, hopefully this will work because I'm using a PDF rather than PPT, but it should still work.
Okay,
now I can see. Now I can see.
It works well.
So now I'm not using full screen, so maybe the full screen doesn't work. So what part did you lose it after the first page? Could you see the first page?
Yeah, yes. After the first page we lost, but now it works, so it's okay. Okay,
so I was basically just reading, so if you could understand what I was saying, then it shouldn't be a problem, but I haven't given any examples yet. But these are the things that I'm planning to talk about. And then I'm just talking now about the principles of clause structure. So I'll have to scroll. I don't like scrolling, but somehow the full screen mode doesn't seem to be working in Zoom. Okay, so this is going to slow things down a bit, but and might be annoying. But anyway, we'll go with this. So as I mentioned, in the 80s, we started to move away from this kind of Indo-European bias to some extent, but there was still this structuralist bias of seeing the languages as wholes rather than seeing them as individual constructions and individual things that we need to be comparing. On my own account, in the 1980s, I was trying to understand how Chinese works grammatically. So I studied all of the theories that had come into existence at that time. There were quite a bunch of new theories that were developed in the 1970s and 80s as the alternatives to the Chomskyan program. But I found that in trying to apply those theories to Chinese, there were always problems. In particular, while studying lexical-functional grammar with Joan Bresnan and applying the LFG lexical mapping theory for determining grammatical relations, I found it didn't work, for Chinese at least. There was no way to understand this using LFG, which was based on English. I later found that I could understand what made Chinese different using role and reference grammar, which, while it is also a structuralist unification-based approach to grammar, like LFG and HPSG and all the others that were developed at that time, it did not force languages into a single mode, as rather than being based on English, it was based on non-Indo-European languages such as the Amerindian language, Lakota, the Austronesian language, Tagalog, the Australian language, Dirbal, and the Papuan language, Barai. The RG method is to look at the different constructions of the language to see if there's a restricted neutralization of semantic roles for constraining the appearance of certain semantic roles and particular positions in the construction. Using this constructionist approach to grammatical relations, I found that unlike English, Chinese had not grammaticalized constraints on the identification of the roles of reference and discourse in the constructions I looked at. That is, there was nothing we could call what people had called the grammatical subject and direct object. I don't actually use those terms. I just talk about it from the point of view of constraining reference, the identification of reference and discourse. In later research, I found this is also true of many other Sino-Tibetan languages I worked on. In fact, Wei Zhao and Lu Shuxiang, Lian Thompson had all argued that Chinese does not manifest the grammatical subject, in other words, no grammatical relations. and clause structure is straightforwardly topic comment. But their characterizations of Chinese were misunderstood due to how they talked about this, with Zhao and Yu using the term subject when they clearly stated they meant topic, and Lee and Thompson using the term subject for the agent of the clause, even though they clearly stated it was not a grammatical relation, as in English it was simply a semantic role. In particular, Lee and Thompson talked about Chinese as topic prominent, and this has been misunderstood as just another structuralist clause type with a grammatical subject, but with frequent topicalization rather than the absence of grammatical constraints on role identification. Van Balen, back in 1981, had already shown that languages did not necessarily show the same restricted neutralizations in all of their constructions, but the results of the work on Chinese meant that the typology of alignment systems, which up to that point had been limited to nominative, accusative, and ergative absolutive and active patterns, had to be expanded to include what I called neutral patterns, such as in Chinese, where there was no alignment of semantic or grammatical roles. As mentioned above, we no longer talk about whole languages in terms of such features, but look at the individual constructions. In the case of Chinese, although I did not find any restricted neutralizations in the constructions I looked at back in the 1980s, Liu Danqing, who we just heard from, has argued that some constructions in Chinese are in the process of grammaticalizing restricted neutralizations of semantic roles. This is another reason why we can't make blanket statements about languages. They aren't fixed systems, but human behavior, and so change constantly, just as our other behaviors change with the circumstances, and due to fads and constant conventionalization of new uses and forms. I also argued on the basis of my findings that we should not use terms like SOV, SVO, etc., as these imply that all languages have the categories SVO and SV and O, and that they are involved in either determining constituent order or are determined by it. And so we need instead to pay attention to the actual causal factors, that is the principles of clause structure that determine the order or the patterns in different languages. This one in particular, I had to argue with Matthew Dreyer and Martin Hasselmath in the journal Linguistic Typology and elsewhere. Even where these patterns might be said to be true, they may not be true for the whole language. For example, Knud Lambrecht has shown that in spoken French, the canonical SVO structure that is said to characterize French is pragmatically marked structure, quite limited in its natural discourse. So it's best to actually look at the diversity within the individual languages as well as across languages. Even more radically, in trying to understand how it could be that languages could be so different in terms of what aspects of the interpretation are constrained, and yet we can still use them to communicate, I came to the realization that the meaning was not in the words and structures, but created in the minds of the interlocutors by inferring each other's intentions in using communicative acts of different types, including, but not limited to, language. Another language that I've been trying to understand for many years is Tagalog, the national language of the Philippines. Due to the above-mentioned assumption that languages had to be either nominative, accusative, or ergative absolutive, many scholars have tried to force Tagalog into one of these two alignment types. By manipulating the data in particular ways, it's easy to make the case either way, but this is because Tagalog is neither type. Tagalog clause structure works by very different principles, both in terms of information structure and in terms of grammar and morphology. The structure of the clause is essentially a type of referential phrase used for a number of different functions. As was mentioned earlier, I think by Dr. Park, the structure of the clause and the structure of the noun phrase are very similar. In Tagalog, they are exactly the same. But there is no such thing as a noun phrase in Tagalog. There are phrases, but nothing we can call a noun phrase. But anyway, the same type of phrase is used for clauses and referential expressions, but also other types of expressions, but has a topic in apposition to the phrase. So if you compare the examples, for example, kaibigan lang siya ng aking tatay and tinanong lang siya ng aking tatay. Here we have two, so he is only my father's friend, and my father only asked him, are the two full utterances that I'm analyzing here. But if you take the kaibigan ng aking tatay, which is my father's brother, which is the the main part of number 1. And tinanong ng aking tatay, asked by my father, which is number 2. These are phrases of exactly the same type in Tagalog, though in English we have to translate them very differently. So it shows that these things are not really separated, because the first one we might call a noun phrase in English, and the second one we might call a verb phrase or even a clause in English, but they're exactly the same structure in Tagalog. Because the topic often takes the form of a second position clitic, as in these examples with xia, and there is a large number of other second position clitics, such as lang in these examples, which means only. These clitic pronouns and particles break up what we would normally think of as a phrase. So assumptions of linearity and compositionality are challenged by the facts of Tagalog. In fact, the linker linking the two parts of the phrase may appear cliticized to the topic pronoun. So, for example, in 3, wala siyang pera, without the topic, and you can drop the topic, which is xia here. Xia is the topic, but it occurs in the middle of the clause. And the linker, the marker that links wala and pera together actually occurs on the topic, the reference to the topic. So without the topic being there, it would be walang pera si Michael, or walang pera alone, you could say. So this is an interesting and very challenging for somebody from an Indo-European perspective to try to understand how something like this could work. The topic can be anything the speaker wants to profile the event. I'm using topic, by the way, in 2 ways. There is, in Tagalog, there is the pragmatic concept of topic, which is what the clause is about. And then there's also a grammatical marking of topic in Tagalog, which I'll talk about. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but just to mention that the topic in Tagalog can be anything the speaker wants to profile the event or situation from the point of view of, whether or not it is what has traditionally been considered a direct argument of the predicate. But it has a particular grammatical status in that it has a different marking from non-topics, and in many utterances is co-referenced by the morphological marking on the predicate. Like for example, in 4, we have the topic is siriki, which occurs at the end of the clause, and the clause is don't use up all the gasoline on Ricky. Now, in this case, in English, you could not make Ricky the topic of this clause. But in Tagalog, you can make anything, as I said, the topic of the clause. And here, the topic is marked on the predicate, the word finish or ubus. You have a suffix an, which is, we call it a locational topic. It marks very broadly something we consider the location of the action. So you would use it if I wanted to make the store where I bought something, the topic, I would also use that as the topic marker. So here, the one affected by using gasoline is Ricky, and he has made the topic of the clause. The clause then takes the form of the location topic construction. Now notice metaphorically how it's also the same in English that we use a locational metaphor to use up the gasoline on Ricky. We use the on for the one affected. Also, I didn't mention just now in the similarity in the clause and the noun phrase is that the non-topical reference, the pronoun system in Tagalog has 2 sets of pronouns, actually 3, but the 2 main sets of pronouns are topical and non-topical pronouns, and the non-topical pronouns are the same as the genitive pronouns. So like in this sentence, huwag mo, the mo there, the second person non-topic, actually is a genitive, is also used in genitives, like if I say, tatay mo, your father. So you can also use it exactly the same morpheme in those 2 ways. So that it shows you the similarity. And as the notion, another issue that comes up is that the notion of topic, what the clause is about, is not as straightforward as it might seem, as this can differ between languages. So this is another insight I had working on Tagalog and also Chinese to some extent. Tagalog has a much richer set of morphosyntactic possibilities for maintaining the reference to particular reference as topic than English does. And so very often what is the topic in Tagalog, what the clause clearly is about, will not be the topic in the English translation. So English does not allow us, just as Professor Liu mentioned with the statistics he showed, where Chinese, you can put anything in topic position. So you'll get 300 and something you know, non-agentive topics in topic position in clauses in the text they looked at, where they only had 16 of them in English. English has constraints on what can appear as the topic. English can achieve some of these results, like in Tagalog and Chinese, with some using mark constructions like clefs, but it does not do so to the same extent or naturally as Tagalog and Chinese do. That the grammatical topic in Tagalog is what the clause is about, though, can be seen from the fact that any predication minus its topic can function as a nominalization understood to denote what would be the topic of that predication. And that's what I meant by it's in apposition, because the predication can stand alone to refer to the topic, and the topic, of course, is just there. So they're co-referential, and that's why I say they're in apposition to each other, because they're both referring to the same thing. The morphological marking of semantic role is also not of the type we are familiar with from Indo-European languages, as it marks very fine distinctions not only between actor, patient, location, theme, and benefactive, but even, for example, distinctions between several types of actor. For example, in a Tagalog single argument clause, semantically different arguments can be marked differently. There is no S, you know, like we normally often do when we're looking at languages, we look at SA and O or SA and P, but there is no S in Tagalog. There's no neutralization of those roles for in single argument clauses. For example, given the root dulas, slip or slide, madulas is a non-volitional actor, so with the ma there, can be used for to slip unintentionally, whereas the infix in dumulas can be used for slide, because is a more intentional type of actor. And the marking of an intransitive actor can be different from that of a transitive actor, even with the same root. So labas, which just means outside, can be used predicatively. You can use any word predicatively and any word referentially. That's one of the reasons why people say there are no form classes in Tagalog, but there are form classes, but they're morphologically defined, not like what we think of as noun and verb. So these labas can be used as a predicate, and so if you use it for an intransitive type of structure or a single argument structure, you could say lumabas, meaning I go out, lumabas ako, I go out, I went out. But if it's I bring something out, you use the same word there, labas, but you use a different agentive marker, maglabas. So you could say I brought out the bananas or whatever. And I also use the analysis of Tagalog clause constituents to argue that not only were there no word classes of the type expected given an Indo-European bias, but that there are no phrase structures in the language that we could identify as noun phrase and verb phrase. We would expect that, of course, if there was no nouns and verbs, we would expect there's no unique noun phrase and verb phrase. As I mentioned, there are structures, very clear structures, the noun phrase and the, not noun, but noun, which is a Tagalog particle that I call a relational marker that links two things together in a particular kind of relation. And then there's the linker type phrase. Those are the two key phrase types in Tagalog, and they're used for many different types of structures, including the clause structure itself as a noun phrase. This then meant the typology of clause structure systems had to be expanded again to include the Philippine type, which also exists in some residual form in languages outside of the Philippines. Okay, so next, turning to information structure. Given that the structure of the clause in Chinese is not based on grammatical relations, the question then is, what are the governing principles for the structure of clauses in Chinese? What I found from looking at natural data was that all of the clause patterns I found in the text could be explained using simple information structure principles. The essential idea is that speakers distinguish between topical and non-topical reference by putting reference to topical reference before the verb and reference to non-topical reference after the verb. Lambrecht's theory, Knud Lambrecht, his theory of focus structure, which the different patterns consider predicate focus, which is basically topic comment, sentence focus, which is presentative constructions where there's no topic, or argument focus for the missing argument in an open proposition, which also has no topic, and Chinese particular variants. for example, a topic comment structure that has either a presentative construction or another topic comment structure as the comment. For example, Professor Liu's example 17, one analysis, possible analysis that he didn't present was that他学习努力 is just simply a topic comment structure with a topic comment structure as the comment of the larger topic comment structure. So 他 what? 他学习努力 他学习怎么样学习努力 So it's just simply a double topic comment structure. These can be used to explain all of the patterns found, even those that could not be explained using assumptions based on Indo-European and using very simple principles of information structure. This then allowed us to expand our typology of clause structure types even further, as differences in information structure had been largely ignored as a governing principle in typology, except for some work by Bernard Comrie. This, as well as the Tagalog facts, also confirm the superiority of the constructionist approach to language structure. Work on grammaticalization also showed that grammaticalization is not of individual words into grammatical morphemes, but the grammaticalization of constructions. Turning back to Tagalog, another way that Tagalog has led us to expanding our understanding of the typology of languages is in terms of information structure. Many typologists, including the Prague School, which pioneered the study of information structure, assumed that in all languages the topic had to be clause initial. They believed this because this was the case in all the languages they had looked at. This is the problem with induction. If your conclusions are only as valid as your data. So when you go to look at data outside that, then you might find totally different patterns. And so while topic comment order is common in the languages of the world, Tagalog has shown us that it's not the only pattern found, as Tagalog has comment topic order in unmarked predicate focused clauses, like the one we just looked at. Tagalog also overturned the generally held assumption that the theme of the clause, the speaker's starting point, I'm using the word theme here in the theme ream concept, not theme as a movable object. So the theme of the clause is the speaker's starting point, the beginning of the utterance, is necessarily associated with topic. Some people had said that, like even Halliday and the Prague School had argued that topic was a necessary part of theme. In fact, theme is important because it's not only the speaker's starting point, but also the starting point of the hearer's interpretation and projection. That is the anticipation of what is to come. And so what appears in the theme position, what appears in the utterance initial position, influences the rest of the interpretation. And it was shown that languages differ in terms of what sorts of information they put into theme position. So Tagalog, for example, is very different from English. English puts marking of the grammatical mood in the theme. Tagalog puts the predicate and morphology related to the interpersonal meanings and the semantic role of the topic in initial or second position. So this is saying that topic does not have to. So in my paper, the 2019 paper, I'm arguing that topic and comment are actually a separate functional structure from theme and ream, that they are not the same thing. So we separate theme as the speaker's starting point, which does not necessarily have to include the topic. This then forced us to further expand the typology of possible clause types to include languages with common topic structure, and also to create a typological parameter of what is grammaticalized to appear in the theme position, which differs among languages, and to pay attention to how languages differ in terms of what can be the topic of the clause. Okay, the next thing is non-systemic morphology. In the early 1990s, I had a project to collect data for a database of the forms and use of morphology and clause patterns of all the Tibeto-Burman languages, and began comparing them from both historical and typological perspectives. In looking at agentive and non-agentive marking, I came to see that unlike what had been assumed based on Indo-European languages, the morphological marking in many Tibeto-Burman languages did not take the form of obligatory grammatical paradigms and did not fall into the neat alignment types assumed in typology, but was semantically based role marking that was not obligatory, did not form strict paradigms, and the use of which varied depending on the type of situation, the type of referent being marked, and the determination of the speaker as to whether the roles of the reference referred to needed to be disambiguated. At the time, I called it non-systemic marking because we had, up to that point, we had always assumed all marking had to be very systemic. And so here I was thinking, okay, well, this one is not systemic. So I called it non-systemic marking. It later came to be recognized in many other languages, even outside Sino-Tibetan, and accepted as a phenomenon of interest in typology, though this phenomenon is nowadays often called differential object marking and differential agent marking, or optional case marking. There's been quite a lot of work on this in quite a few different language families. Part of what motivated this also was in 1986, Matthew Dreyer argued for establishing primary object and secondary object marking as a structural type of alignment in contrast to direct object and indirect object. So again, at that time, they were still assuming all languages had fixed alignment systems. And so if you find something new, it had to necessarily be just a different type of fixed alignment. His paper assumed that marking had to be this kind of grammatical relation. In reaction to this, I argued first in 1992, and then a little bit more in 1994, and then summarized a lot of different work on relational marking in 2004. That relational marking in Tibeto-Burman languages that ostensibly followed the same pattern as was described for this new alignment, his primary object marking, was not a grammatical relation, but used for semantic disambiguation when there are two possible agents in the clause. And so it's based on an actor-non-actor contrast, and it's not limited to objects, as in some languages, the same marking was used for a number of different kinds of roles as long as they were non-agents. This marking could also appear in the same clause as agentive marking in some languages, showing it also does not fall into a neat nominative accusative or ergative absolutive type of pattern. This contrasts with clear semantic role-based patient marking, which I also found in some a minority of Tibeto-Burman languages. Both types of marking then are semantically based, with agentive and patientive marking showing what role a referent has, and what I call anti-agentive marking showing what a role a referent doesn't have. Excuse me a second. Okay, the next thing is word order typology. While carrying out my comparative Tibeto-Burman project, I became aware of some problems with the way word order typology was carried out, and also with the conclusions of some of the studies. In looking at the patterns found in Tibeto-Burman, I found that one could not simply compare on the basis of semantics, as had been done by Greenberg and his followers, that instead one had to take into account the morphosyntactic form and usage. For example, in Burmese, property concepts appear in either what they would call an adjective-noun structure or a noun-adjective structure, depending on whether the modifier is nominalized or not. Identifiability and other pragmatic factors can also influence constituent order. For example, Jordan mentions that in Cho-Chin, another Tibeto-Burman language, the demonstratives can either precede or follow the noun, and says that demonstratives follow the noun when they refer to some object already mentioned. As Paul Hopper has argued, there's no alternative in typological studies to a careful language-by-language study of textual occurrences of word order. It also turned out that the most common set of word order patterns found in my data for Tibeto-Burman languages was one that John Hawkins had said was not possible. So this brings up many, many different issues. And originally I'd written a paper in 1994, and it was actually Professor Liu Danqing who suggested that I should publish it. Originally I wasn't going to publish it because it was very critical of the current typological methodology. But he suggested I publish it, and I ended up publishing it in 2002. Okay, the next thing is hierarchical person marking. Among the Tibeto-Burman languages, some manifest person marking on the predicate. It's sometimes called pronominalization. Again, because of the assumption that languages were either nominative accusative or ergative absolutive, these systems had been argued to follow an ergative absolutive pattern, but I showed that the interpretation only held if the topic of the clause was always third person. If we look instead at more data, we find that the pattern is hierarchical, with preference given to first and second person marking, with some of the languages manifesting this marking also having inverse marking for when the situation was against the hierarchy. That is, like a third person actor acting on a first and second person. So here's an example from the Rawang language. Riye, we carry them is just carry, first person plural, and then a non-past declarative marker. Riye is they carry us, where you have the same exact pattern as in A, but here you've added the, what I've marked here as non-first person. It's essentially similar to the inverse marking that you find in American Indian languages, which are also have hierarchical systems, usually in fourth person, but third person marking. But here it's in terms of the person marking. Another interesting fact of these systems from the point of view of typology is that the referent marked by the person marking does not need to be what we think of usually as a direct argument of the verb. That is, it could be a possessor or even someone not mentioned in the clause, but affected by the situation. There's also, I just briefly mentioned, I didn't put it in here, but another thing that kind of violates these kind of assumed patterns from Indo-European is that you can mark the same argument several times within a single predicate. So in this language, Rawang, you can mark the first person up to 5 times in one predicate. Now that would violate all kinds of rules in formal syntax, but this is the way language is. And as I said, you should trust the language. It will teach you much. The Chang language is another example that has another language that has both semantic-based person marking agents, and also hierarchical marking for marking the person affected by the situation. So in example 6, we have, don't be noisy here, your father will be angry. But here, the person who the father will be angry at is marked on the verb as the one affected. So the son here at the end of the clause marks the person who is going to be affected by the clause, by the action of the person in the clause. So it's the father who is who's getting angry, and it's a mono single argument clause, but it takes the kind of affected undergoer. I mark it as you. It's not really undergoer in a strict syntactic sense. It's just whoever is affected by the action. So that's something also that violates all kinds of Indo-European based rules. So we really should just ignore those kind of rules. Another thing that came up was until was clausal noun modifying construction. So until the late 1980s, when Yoshiko Matsumoto started talking about Japanese relative clauses as being quite different from English relative clauses, there was an assumption that basically clausal modifiers of nouns all work generally the same way, and they were all considered relative clauses, just like in the European, and they were all considered in typological schemes like Keenan and Comrie as if they were all the same. Later, Bernard Comrie recognized the Japanese type as a separate typological type and called it the Asian type of relative clause. And he looked at other languages as well and grouped them together as the Asian type of relative clause in a couple of papers. And somewhat later, Comrie and Matsumoto and a group of us got together and had a project to look at different Asian languages from this point of view, and produced a volume of papers published in 2017. This volume showed the many different situations that can be covered with the Asian type of clausal noun modifier that can't be expressed using an English and an Indo-European type of relative clause, including ones where the head of the relative clause is not an argument of the modifying clause, so there's no gap or anything. So like, in this one, I wonder, or actually wonder if there aren't any speech which doesn't gain weight. You can't say that in English. So in English, to make this make sense in English, we have to add a whole bunch of stuff that's not in the Japanese. And it's not like, hidden or something, it's just not there. And Chinese, of course, is very much like this. In the volume, Chinese is the most radical in terms of the number of situations in which the same construction, which is in Chinese, in effect, a nominal compound as it involves a nominalized clause modifying a noun, can be used. So like in 我最近跑步的音乐都是 GOT7 的歌. So in this one, 跑步的音乐, or 我最近跑步的音乐, if we say it in English, the music that I recently run is got 7 songs, GOT 7 songs, you know, again, we have to put in a whole bunch of other stuff to make it make sense in English, to make it actually an argument of some verb in order for it to be possible in English. But it's very different in Chinese and Japanese. Now, turning to transitivity and transitivity harmony, work on the typology and history of Chinese and Tagalog led me to being a proponent of the constructionist approach to understanding language structures. This began personally and also in the field of linguistics more generally with grammatical relations, but I later came to see it as necessary for all aspects of grammar, and in 2011 co-edited a special issue of Studies in Language arguing for a constructionist approach to transitivity based mainly on Asian languages. Another contribution of Asian languages to typology is the phenomenon of transitivity harmony. This is where verbs in serial verb constructions or complex predicates must agree in terms of their transitivity. In Rwang, this means a transitive phase verb appearing with an intransitive main verb must be intransitivized, generally with the reflexive middle marker xi. So if you look at examples 9a and 9b, we have the same verb. In Rwang, the transitivity is a very important aspect of the grammar, but it's constructional. So you can have the same verbs appearing in an intransitive construction or appearing in a transitive construction. So in A, you have the verb eat, eat soft food, like rice, appearing in an intransitive construction. So the dang, to finish, needs to be intransitivized using the reflexive middle marker. Here, it doesn't have the reflexive middle marking sense, but this grammatical marker has been generalized to as a intransitivizer for a number of uses. So this is one of them. So when you want to use this verb finish in this intransitivizing construction, you have to have this middle marker on there. Whereas if it's in the transitive construction, angi ampong lo amdang dua, then here you don't need to transitivize it. It can just use the and dung together, with here being transitive, understood as transitive. And again, there's several different markers of transitivity. There's agentivity marking on the topic, and then there's also the transitive past marker as opposed to the intransitive past marker. And there's also, of course, a specific object that appears. That's what kind of triggers the use of the transitive marking. Now, another thing I found in working on Rwang and Dulong is middle voice marking. Now, middle voice marking has been part of the typology literature for a long time, but it was not something scholars in Asia were familiar with, and so had not been recognized in Tibeto-Burman languages. In documenting the Dulong and Rwang languages, I found structures that fit the prototype comparative category of middle voice, for example, Kimmer in 1993 and 94. And this itself was a contribution to typology, but also discussed the development of the use of the form from reflexive to middle voice and stative using the concepts of markedness and prototypes. So this is a way that helps us to understand the development of these morphological systems. So here's an example of the use of the same form that I just talked about, the xi, in a truly reflexive situation where you say "angnel touchie," where you understand that the fingernails that he is cutting are his own because of the use of the reflexive middle marker. So it's similar. The way the kind of semantic domains in which the middle marking is used is the same or very similar to those used in Romance languages, for example, like French, where you say, I wash myself the hands. But in Romance languages, it's done with clitic pronouns, whereas this she is an invariable marker that occurs after the verb. It's a suffix that occurs after the verb with all persons. It doesn't change at all. I also found that several other languages in the family manifested marking that might also be considered middle voice marking. But more recently, Mark Post and Yankee Modi have looked again at the relevant marking in some of these languages, some of the other languages that I talked about. This was a small group called the Tani languages, using much larger corpora. They've been doing field work on this language for these languages for a long time, and so they have much better data than I had, and have argued that while some uses of the marking seem to be like middle marking, the marking has a broader range of uses in those languages that they subsume under what they call subject autonomy marking. And this represents a new structural type that they're putting forward, so far found only in these Asian languages. Okay, my last topic is evidentials, which came up a little bit earlier. Among the Tibeto-Burman languages, there are a number that manifest different types of evidential systems. Work on these systems has led to new insights recently into the typological complexity and subtlety of these systems, and have overturned some previous assumptions about evidential systems. For example, Willett, 1988, argued that evidentials do not occur within the scope of negation, yet we do find such usage in Aka, a Tibeto-Burman language. Work on Tibetan has shown that contra the standard definition of evidentials as grammatical marking of information source, and only that, the definition should be more broadly the representation of source and access to information according to the speaker's perspective and strategy, because there are many other factors involved. The empirical study and documentation of the Tibetan varieties, many Tibetan varieties, has shown that simply saying evidentials provide information about the objective source of what is said, does not cover all of the many actual uses of evidential marking. In particular, as reflected in the definition I just gave, in order to understand the use of evidential marking, we need to take into account the speaker's access to information, not just its source, and the subjective strategy and perspective of the speaker in representing a particular state of affairs. Access here refers to nonverbal access to information, such as sensory access and inference available to the speaker. Sensory access includes sight, smell, hearing, taste, touch, and also endopathic, somewhat inner sensations, such as being cold or painful or hungry, and emotions such as being afraid or being angry, as well as self-awareness, the mental activity of being aware of what you're doing. Oh, I'm thinking about this right now, kind of, self-awareness. In some cases, the same evidential marker can be used to represent different kinds of access to information. For example, the standard Tibetan sensory marker Duk marks information access to not only the 5 senses, but also endopathic sensations, depending on the context, but not egophoric. It's not used for marking egophoric, just for these types of sensations. The speaker also often can subjectively choose between different forms of evidential marking in reporting the same event, and can even lie or manipulate others with evidentials. So this is where the strategy comes in. You have to take that into account, that the speaker may have a particular strategy in the particular choice of evidential. There are different ways, like if you say there's a fire, it may be that you just saw smoke, it may be that you smelled smoke, it may be that all of them, and then you have a choice of which evidential you want to do. Is it visual evidential, or is it something you smelled, or maybe you heard something, or maybe whatever. There's all kinds of reasons why you might, ways that you are going to profile the event, you might say. Evidential marking can also be affected by considerations of politeness or degree of consensus or disagreement, different states of consciousness, like you're dreaming, you're awake, you're drunk, intentionality. I'll give you an example of intentionality in a minute, and cognitive access, identifiability can affect the choice of evidential marking. For example, in Chang, which also has evidential marking, when the directed visual evidential is used with a first-person actor, the sense is that the action was unintentional, as in the following example, this number 11. The context for this utterance was the speaker having hit the person while leaning back and stretching his arms without looking behind him. So you say, I hit him accidentally. You use, even though it's first person speaking about first person's action, you're using a visual thing as if, oh, I just saw that I hit him. So this is quite a different type of situation from intentional action. So these languages have taught us the importance of looking at cognitive access and its interaction with the source rather than just simply source by itself. Okay, my time is up exactly 1:50. All right, so I will end there. And thank you very much. I hope there's some comments, questions. Okay.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation, Professor LaPolla. Now, let's have time to ask questions and discuss Professor LaPolla's presentation. Is there anyone who wants to ask about today's presentation?
Okay, I think my friend are just hesitate to ask dear Professor LaPolla, so I'll do that. Nice to see you, Professor LaPolla. I'm Keun-Seok Lim, studying at Kookmin University. I'm happy to see you on our Zoom that I haven't expected before this weird Corona-19 era. Actually, I have two questions, so you can skip my first one because I'm struggling with linguistic typology, but still I need study more. So firstly, I am not sure whether I understood your presentation well, but your presentation seems to show us the universalism or the largely accepted assumptions in the domain of linguistic typology should be reconstructed very carefully.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't believe in universalism at all, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And at this point, you showed us that, I mean, 8 subtopics that, I mean, Asian languages can contribute to for that. But as a, I mean, not greener, but as a person who's struggling with linguistic typology, sometimes in linguistic typology, the concept of onomasiology and universalism can confuse some people like me, just struggling with linguistic typology. So as far as I know, onomasiology is the one of the basic concept of linguistic typology, but sometimes there are just some overlap between onomasiology or universalism. Yeah, I'm not sure for you it's very clear, but for people like me, it is approach of onomasiology or universalism, they can confuse sometimes. So could you help us? For, of course, you can skip my first question if you want. And second one is related to our first presentation of Professor Chino Park. He mentioned the advantageability in Tibet languages. And you posed 2 questions, one of them related to the evidentiality in Tibetan languages. So, and actually our chair mentioned that in the opening ceremony, we are studying twice a month on specific subject in linguistic typology. And this recent topic is the egophoricity. So we studied Newari and some languages in Tibetan languages. And it seems that you think the markers or forms of the Tibetan language that are evidentials one, not egophoric or conjunct, disjunct, something like that. So could you give us your I mean, brilliant opinion on that?
Well, not so brilliant, but the idea, if you read the paper I shared with everybody, that there are different markers. So egophoric and evidential, so when we talk about it, like in the paper, Nicola Tornado and I talk about these as part of the whole evidential system, but they're doing different things. So with the egophoric marking, so like in Tibetan, you have the ye or you have ni, depending on whether you're using an existential or a plain copula. So if you say na pöbayin, I am a Tibetan, right? So there you're using egophoric, where you're using an egophoric type of marking. You're not using what we normally think of as an evidential in the sense of it's not based on some source. Mm-hmm. It's based more, as I mentioned in my brief comment there, it's based on your epistemic authority.
Yeah.
Which is similar to, like, those of you, if you know Japanese, in Japanese, I can say, biru o nomitai, I want to drink beer, right? You can use the tai suffix in Japanese, but I cannot say, you want to drink beer and use the Thai suffix, right? So because I have epistemic authority to say that I want to drink beer, that's what we call these endopathic kind of emotions. So I have the desire to drink beer. So that's an endopathic kind of thing. Only I really know that, and only I have the epistemic authority to talk about that. Yeah. Whereas when I talk about somebody else, I can only go with the visual or inferential epistemics. I cannot do it on the basis of this egophoric, because I'm talking about someone else. Whereas if it's egophoric in the sense of like milieu, there are people with me. I can say, you know, milieu in Tagalog. I mean in Tibetan, as opposed to mido, where I see some people there. So one is kind of you're talking about it from the point of view of your own awareness of something that's based on your kind of internal knowledge system, I guess you might call it, whereas the other one is based on some kind of external stimulus. So if you want to separate those as two categories, that's fine, because they are really, in a sense, doing different things. Okay. But normally, when we talk about them, we consider them one system, even though they're doing somewhat different things. So one is marking kind of reaction to some stimulus. One is marking your internal state, knowledge state, or emotions, or something like that.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right. And the first question, one of the things I actually started in philosophy before I moved into linguistics, and one of the things that annoys me about philosophy, I still do. I actually teach in the philosophy department here in NTU as well as in linguistics. One thing that annoys me about philosophers is very similar to what happens in linguistics as well, is people think that just by throwing a label on something, you have explained it, or you have understood it by just putting a label on something. And those labels, once you label something, it's kind of tainted with everything to do with it has ever done with that label. So I really try to avoid those kind of labels, and I just try to explain things as they are. That's why I don't like SOV. I don't like saying a language is nominative accusative, or I don't like all these different labels. I don't like that. I've argued in print that you should really just explain what's going on with each language. And in terms of, but I could say I don't believe in anything I make a distinction in terms of universality, in terms of what we might call de facto universality and de jure universality. So de jure universality would mean that they're necessarily universal. So like in formalist linguistics, they assume certain things are necessarily universal. And even a lot of the so-called functionalist approaches, including RRG, rule and reference grammar, assume certain things are universal. I don't assume anything is necessarily universal, because we've only looked at a small number of languages out of the total thousands of languages available. We've only looked at a few hundred. So we don't really know what's possible and what's not possible. We could never say something is not possible. And that was something that really bothered me about typology, is trying to say that some word order patterns are not possible or something like that. Because it was just really faulty reasoning. But de jure is something I definitely think shouldn't really be talked about. But de facto, there are things that are de facto universals, possibly things that are shared reactions to some situation. So say, for example, in culture, I don't make a distinction between language and other aspects of culture. They're all governed by the same principles. They're all behavior. Language is not a thing, it's a behavior. So it's governed by the same principles as our other behaviors. So if you think about, probably every culture has something like a bowl, right? So we all need to drink water, and you can stick your face in a river and drink water that way, but it's much easier to use your hands to pull some water up, right? And then many cultures have taken a piece of bamboo or taken some other thing and made a bowl out of it. So possibly you'll find something like that in every single culture, but does that mean that there's some hardwired bowl in our brains, or does it just mean that we're all reacting to something in the environment in the same way? Because we find, actually, I edited a book in 2015 looking at non-linguistic factors that influence linguistic structure, that we find more and more we've been looking at these things that our language, our way of, our whole culture, it was reacting to things in our environment, geography, rainfall, the shape of our islands, if we live on islands, all kinds of things can affect the way we talk about things, the way we understand things, and then that of course influences how we talk about things. Is there anything that's absolutely universal? I don't know.
Okay.
I can't say for sure. Never say never.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a little over the set time, but it'd be nice to take some time to briefly discuss the questions posted in the chatting room. During the presentation, questions are being posted in the chat room in Zoom program. Professor Bach, can you explain the question in the chat room? This question is
류단칭 선생님한테 한 거예요.
네, 류단칭 교수님께서 아까 발표하신 거에 대해서
네.
박종 교수님께서 질문을 이렇게 해주셨는데 종합 토론 시간 하는 것보다 지금 약간 시간을 내서 조금 질문을 하고 토론을 하면 어떨까 합니다.
그런데 지금 시간이 돼요? 안 되잖아요.
3시인데 3시 30분까지 있는데 조금 어떻게 할까요? 3시
지금 시간이 있어요?
네,
네, 지금 좀 하는 게 더.
라폴라 선생 저 퀘션부터 받지 그래요.
그럴까요? 지금
예, 라폴라 선생님
한마디
질문하겠는데요.
네네.
Professor LaPolla.
Hello.
Hello. Glad to see you after
again.
my email about ICCS hosting.
Right.
Corona is a problem, and right. You mentioned languages that have the evidential that shows the internal, subjective feelings and sensations, right? And we have the same kind of function of our direct evidential 더 in Korean. For instance, I was busy, 더라, and so on. Then, that shows that I had that kind of feeling, and I sensed it. It's not visual, but it is expressed by the same evidential marker, and it's very interesting. I have a long discussion of it in my recently published paper, so I can email you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for mentioning it. So that's a very kind of widespread phenomenon in different languages.
Right. Well, I don't like it. I don't want to say anything is universal, as I just mentioned, but there are lots of things that you do find some commonalities, but I really argue strongly for treating each language on its own and not assuming anything about languages. So it's very good if you do find things that are similar, and then you can try to look for patterns across languages. That's what typology is about, to try to find if we have some things, but based on comparative concepts rather than assuming the same categories. It's a very different thing to say, okay, we're going to compare these on some kind of meta concept, like a comparative category, as opposed to saying that they are the same category, right? So I don't assume the same category. We don't, in typology now, we don't assume that we assume that the languages each have their own unique categories, and so we have to describe it on its own terms, and then if we do comparison, we then have to, that's a different step altogether to see, okay, how does that relate to other languages? But I'm very happy that when things do show some kind of similarity across languages, then we need to explain that using some kind of cognitive or environmental principles, or even sometimes language contact or whatever. There's many different ways that we might explain it. But yes, thank you.
저희가 3시 30분까지 3시 분이 그다음 세션을 하니까 여기 질문을 조금 더 받고 종합 토론
네.
시간을 좀 생략하는 게 어떨까 싶습니다.
예, 하나 질문을 해도 괜찮겠죠? 그러면
Hey, how you
그
doing?
뭐야 라폴라스님한테. 예,
아, 네네.
Hey,
예, Professor Lapolla.
hi, how
I'm
you
so
doing?
pleased, yeah, to see you here. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for your
Yeah,
initial
thank you for your
invitation.
accepting our invitation and giving the wonderful presentation. I
Thank
have
you.
a very simple question. You know, Lian Thompson says that neither subject nor topic is prominent in Tagalog. How do you think of Lian Thompson's classification in terms of prominence of topic or subject?
Well, they haven't actually worked on Tagalog, so I wouldn't take much of what they said about that. And also, even their work in the 70s, people should really talk to Sandy about that, because Sandy doesn't really she doesn't really go along with some of her earlier work from the 70s, because it was very much influenced by formalist ways of thinking. But anyway, in terms of Tagalog, I don't think there is such a thing as a subject. There is what I call the topic, which is interesting in Tagalog, that it's a very different type, in that it has the pragmatic kind of features of a normal topic like Chinese topic, but it also has morphological marking. So this is another way that languages differ in terms of how we identify what is the topic of the clause. So in Chinese, it's being put in initial position of the clause that makes it a topic. If it's not before the verb, it cannot be a topic. So being put in initial position makes it a topic, very simply. Whereas in Tagalog, it mostly appears at the end of the clause, but it can appear in the middle of the clause if it's a second position pronoun, or it can appear in initial position if it's in focus. So but we still can recognize it as a topic because of the marking on the predicate and because of the marking on the pronoun or the referential phrase itself. So it's really quite different. There's a morphological nature to it, and also the kind of more pragmatic nature to it. So it's not really like a subject. And this is actually how the whole debate about subject came up in the 1970s, that Schachter, a specialist on Tagalog, who wrote the best, Schachter Notanis wrote the best grammar of Tagalog. He argued that this thing they called topic had some things that look like subject, but had other things that look like just topic, and so it wasn't really a typical subject, and so there really nothing isn't a subject. And then so people that started that whole 1970s, there was this whole fad of looking at subject, but then one of the problems with that whole thing was looking at subject as a category, where subject is not really a single category. It's a relational concept, and a grammatical relational concept of particular types of constructions. And so that's why now we're looking more at constructions rather than assuming these global categories in languages, and even in languages that supposedly have subjects, like Italian and English, they don't work the same way. So, for example, cross-cause co-reference constraint in English is a very strong one. So if I say the man dropped a melon and burst, it has to mean the man burst, not the melon burst. But in Italian, that's not the case. In Italian, if you say that, it's of course the melon that burst. And that's true of most languages, actually, because most languages have not grammaticalized the kind of constraints on referent identification that English has. So to assume that there is some universal kind of category called subject is problematic, or that we can even so-called identify subject in any individual language, when really the more empirical approach is to look at the different constructions and say, okay, what's going on in each of these constructions? Can we identify constraints on the identification of reference and the role of reference in discourse? So that's the approach that I take. So I don't even talk about subject as a concept anymore. I don't know if that answers your question. That's 比较啰嗦.
Thank you. 谢谢你.